have to say maybe today, maybe is our best episode of Dear Jane ever, Marcy Little.
Wow, that's high praise for this episode, but we have two really awesome guests. Today's episode at the very least may be like drinking from a fire hydrant with the amount of information.
That doesn't sound pleasant.
That might be new to people.
Yes. This is multi-layered today on Dear Jane. We are going to talk about a study that has been done by a couple of groups, and it's really fascinating because what they have done is they really the subject is coerced abortions, and that in and of itself is plenty of subject matter. But you start to dig in deep, and it really starts to show areas. Number one, on the positive side, where there might be areas where we can work together with those who might be in the middle. But it really also kind of highlights some differences as well. But anyway, we'll get into all that. It's a fantastic episode. But before we do that, let's thank our sponsors of Dear Jane. That is, this time around, it is Choose Life Marketing.
Here's what you need to know about Choose Life Marketing. You may go with your cousin's best friend who is an excellent marketer, and they may know all of the latest and greatest and new trends in digital marketing. They may know how to place ads well. They may know how to adjust campaigns in real time, marketing campaigns. But do they understand your mission as a pro-life organization? That's the question you should be asking yourself, especially in today's political climate where there's so much misunderstanding about pro-life and the pro-life mission. You really want people on your team who understand what you're about and what you're trying to accomplish. That's who Choose Life Marketing is. They employ 70 plus fantastic digital marketing experts who know how to do all of the things that I just described, but they also are passionate about proclaiming a pro-life message and getting the word out about your organization. So whether you are a pregnancy center, whether you work for a pro-life organization, you really should check out our friends at Choose Life Marketing. They'll be able to connect you with the right strategies, the right messaging to come up with the best possible marketing strategy for you. So check them out today, chooselifemarketing.com.
The name of the study is Pivoting to Unwanted and Coerced Abortion, a Manifesto. And two of the authors are going to join us here today on Dear Jane. We've got Monica Snyder with Secular Pro-Life and Eric Scheidler with the Pro-Life Action League joining us here today on Dear Jane. Monica Snyder, Eric Scheidler, thank you very much for joining us here on Dear Jane today. Monica, let's start with you. When we talk about coerced abortions, let's define coerced a little bit more. What exactly are we talking about? What's it look like?
That's a great question. So in the manifesto that we published, we talked about research that looked into coerced abortion, and they asked women to describe for themselves among 4 possible categories how their abortion experience was, and the categories broadly included wanted, accepted, unwanted, and coerced. And I believe it was 10% of the women responded that their abortions were coerced. However, the study did not give a specific definition for coercion. It let them decide amongst those descriptions what they thought best matched their experience. There's at least some, I don't know about a lot, of controversy about this, because sometimes when you talk about coerced abortion, people imagine like an abusive husband with a gun at the one end of the extreme. But other times people talk about the coercion of like economic coercion, or your communities that you live in telling you that they are not going to help you and you better figure it out and you have to do this. And I think it would be interesting to do a qualitative analysis, some in-depth interviews of women who said their abortions were coerced, and see what exactly they mean when they say that, because I do think there is a range of possible definitions. But whichever definition you use, I think it is fair to say that they do not feel that they wanted their abortions, or even that they particularly had a choice. And this is one of the reasons we want so much to talk about, however you're defining the word coerced, we want to talk about the idea of coerced abortions, because we believe that people who might feel very differently about what the laws should be related to abortion should be able to still come together on the idea that we don't want women getting abortions who feel that they were pushed into it and didn't want it. That should be easy common ground between pro-choice and pro-life people.
It should be. Why is it not?
I think it is. So when we talk about pro-choice people, especially those of us who are activists and do this work a lot, I think it's easy for us to be thinking about pro-choice activists or pro-abortion activists, people who are as zealous as we are about this issue and very, very committed to it. That's who we interface with a lot. But I believe that the vast majority of Americans who describe themselves as pro-choice are not that hardcore about it. And in my personal experience, speaking with friends who are pro-choice, some of them passionately pro-choice, when I talk about this concept of coerced abortion, it is common ground. It's no-brainer common ground. And I think it's difficult because of various political reasons to find people who are willing to work publicly together on this. I also think there's very little trust between the activists on either side of this debate. The other side doesn't trust us at all to have women's well-being in mind, and we are flabbergasted as to how they could think otherwise. There's a lot of lack of trust and poor communication, but if you could get past that and just have coffee with an individual person who supports abortion rights, I think the overwhelming majority of them, it is common ground. They don't want women getting abortions who feel that they are pushed into it, but they also don't want us to try to stop them through the law. And so if we can build enough space to talk about remedies that don't have to do specifically with the law. Not to say that our side is going to let the law go. We're not. But as we continue to fight tooth and nail about that elsewhere, it should be easy for us to say, okay, what are other ways that we can help women feel like they have a variety of choices here? How can we support them if this isn't what they want? What do they need to do what they want? I think it is common ground. I think we just need to find people that we can talk to about it.
Eric, we were talking about when we try to define coercion, and Monica touched on this. When I first think of it, I think of the husband, the partner, the guy really pressuring her into doing it. Is that? I mean, it's not just solely that, though, is it? It can take lots of different versions.
Well, there's so many different ways that circumstance and actual individuals conspire to push women towards abortion. But we've long known that men play an outsized role in that abortion decision. For years we've known that if the man is pushing for abortion, the woman is far more likely to get an abortion. If the man is pushing to allow the child to be born or even to parent the child, the woman is far more likely to make that decision. More recent data that a project of Students for Life has uncovered has found that men play a huge role in whether they're the first person that a woman goes to. They're the first person that a woman will listen to when she goes to with that conversation, but that also men don't know that. Men think that their role is supposed to be to say, I'll support you in whatever you choose to do, and just back off and be the bankroll of the abortion or pay child support if it comes to that. But in fact, they play a huge role. And so one of our challenges is to educate men about how willing women will be to listen to them. Because there's a large group of men who are not telling the woman what they really think because they feel like they're not supposed to, but who would want to parent that child, might even want to single parent that child.
We're told not to. We're told we don't have a uterus, so butt out.
That's right. And I think that's an interesting point. I mean, when people realize the role that men play in this, that I think it undermines their sense that men shouldn't have a voice to say. They're going to. They play a role. Do you really want the guy? Do you really want to signal the guy through his whole life? You're supposed to stay out this until someone starts asking you for money. That just doesn't work. Absent fathers is what you get from that. That's just one aspect of this, though, incorporating men. I think that the idea of fighting coerced and unwanted abortions also can help our legal strategy. Because when people learn that those laws against abortion are not just preventing women from accessing something they want, but actually empowering women to resist something that they don't want, that gives them a different perspective on what it means to enact legislation against abortion. You're not just protecting the lives of unborn babies. You are protecting the health, the preferences, the individuality, the selves of a whole host of women in a state that enacts some kind of a limit on abortion, empowering them to say, no, I don't want that abortion.
You mentioned that men are just one source of coercion. What are some of the other common sources of coercion? Why do women feel that way?
Well, employers play a huge role. A boss doesn't want a woman to be off of the factory floor or out of the off the committee for a period of time. So employers are huge. Sort of sociological factors like lack of housing, lack of health care, this is going to sound crazy, but lack of a baby seat. For many families, welcoming another child would mean buying another car in a really tight automobile market. And for pro-life people, we have a hard time getting our heads around the decision to have an abortion because you can't afford a car. But I've been in that position 3 times where I've had to buy a car in order to have another baby. And for regular folks who don't share our ideology and who are looking at all the pressures of life, yeah, that could be the factor that pushes them to get an abortion because they don't want to have to buy another car seat to fit into a vehicle that doesn't fit one.
Monica, what I hear Eric getting at is perhaps a bridge between, you talked before about, the hardcore on each side. This is, politically speaking, you're talking about maybe a bridge between the left and the right, because what the right is saying to the left, Eric mentioned lack of access to health care or affordable housing and things like that. Those are things that resonate with the left, you would think.
Yes, I think that there's a lot of room for common ground here. As a very specific example, there was discussion in the House a couple months ago about changing the way we structure child tax credits to make them more accessible to larger families and to be more beneficial to families. And it had, at least from where we're sitting, pretty bipartisan support. There was a coalition letter including pro-choice advocacy groups and a whole bunch of other groups not related to the abortion issue that was calling for this change. And Secular Pro-Life signed a coalition letter alongside a bunch of pro-life groups, including some very conservative ones, also calling for this change. I think it's one example of how you can find common ground. Maybe they frame things a little bit differently, but a lot of conservatives, in addition to being against abortion, they also want a society that better prioritizes families and the ability to form families more easily. And a lot of left-leaning people, they want better social support for all kinds of marginalized groups. There's huge crossover here. So I think there should be a lot of room here for both sides, both pro-life and pro-choice and both conservative and liberal, to be promoting policies that make it easier to have families. I think there's a lot of room for that. Unfortunately, I don't know how much faith I have in the politicians involved to work with each other, but one thing at a time. I think that the pro-life movement has a reputation, I think largely unearned, frankly, that we are all one-to-one the same as every single hardcore Republican politician, and we are against all possible social welfare policies and all possible help. I get accused regularly of being against school lunches, as a very specific example. And I think that if we could break down the partisanship a little bit and form a few alliances of goodwill people on both sides who genuinely want to help these groups, it would give us a chance to do some good work and to fight that stereotype that I think is totally incorrect. There's a lot of policies that the American public is very, very supportive of if we could just get our politicians in line. Paid family leave is another one. Paid family leave is enormously popular in a bipartisan way when you're looking at the general American public. It breaks down when you get to the level of politicians, and that's a different thing. But I would like it if more pro-life groups and organizations, and we've already seen a lot of this since Dobbs, became a lot more vocal about specifically what we want. We've seen a lot of pro-life organizations sign on to the Make Birth Free attempt. Eric, you and Charlie Camosi put together, you want to talk about the specific policies you called for?
Yeah. In January 2021, I, along with Charlie Camosi of Creighton University, Josh Brahm of Equal Rights Institute, and Jonathan Van Maren of the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform, published a joint statement for a pro-life future at prolifefuture.com. And we called for, our sort of big banner headline was, the pro-life movement must embrace bold new pro-family policies. And we start out by arguing that abortion bans are not enough, that we have to do more. And here's some policies that we know will make a difference. So paid parental leave is a huge one. Flexible work hours. This is something that Senator Josh Hawley has been on the bandwagon, on a soapbox about. He published a piece at Compact Magazine just a little while ago about this problem. if you're trying to schedule prenatal visits, I mean, you're just trying to figure out what to do with the 2 lines that came up on your pregnancy test, and you have a hard enough time getting to the dentist once a year with the work hours and unpredictable situation you have. How are you going to organize 9 months of prenatal visits? It's impossible for so many workers to have the control over their daily lives. So that's a simple one. Affordable housing, affordable health care are big problems. Now, we didn't say in the statement that means single payer Medicare for all or anything like that. We recognize that there are budgetary problems in different states. There are different political philosophies that are sincerely held. There are different ways to get to these solutions, but we need to be aggressively exploring them and doing so vocally in a way that's very clear so that the American people see that we're not just about stopping abortion, that the canards about us controlling women's bodies and not caring about babies once they're born have never been true and are just pure nonsense, and really breaking down that stereotype. So I think there is a moment here when we see, Midwestern Republican senators calling for flexible work hours, guys like Marco Rubio and Mitt Romney calling for, more labor unions in America that will protect the rights of workers, calling for, some way to address the demographic crisis. We know, and this is something we point out I think, Monica, this was maybe some of your research on the article, that maybe I should just hand it over to you to talk about that demographic crisis, the disconnect between family size and what people really want.
Yeah, it's shocking actually, because you see, I feel like it's especially on more the right, you see discussions of the falling fertility rates and what that means and the concerns about it. And you would think that that would translate to just generally people don't want kids as much as they used to. But the polling is more complicated than that. In fact, we talked about it in the manifesto. They found that, let me find it for you specifically. Yeah. Americans' preference for larger families is the highest it's been since 1971, which surprised me when I found that out. And they also did polling. This was very interesting. Gallup did polling of Americans over age 45, asking them how many children they have and what they think the ideal family size would be. And this was covered in an article basically talking about how there are some people who regret parenthood, which is interesting because Gallup found some small percentage, I don't remember now exactly what it was, I think it was 10% or fewer people who had children and wish they hadn't had any, but 50% of the people over age 45 who didn't have children wish that they had, and the article didn't mention that statistic. And in fact, 10% of people over age 45 with no children wish they had 4 or more. Wow. So of course it's true statistically. There will be some people who have children who ultimately are like, maybe I shouldn't have had kids. Nobody's pretending that's impossible. But generally speaking, the aggregate goes in the other direction, and it continues to this day. And yet we do see fertility rates falling for a variety of reasons. And importantly, by the way, they're falling faster in pro-choice states. And by that I mean states that have broad access to abortion. I'm not saying we should ban abortion to require people to have more kids who don't want to. I'm saying there's a lot of layers here, and it's not so clear. I believe the public has a kind of a utopia fallacy about abortion policy. And by this, I specifically mean the moderately pro-choice public seems to think, we want to make sure that women are not in harm's way. We want to make sure nobody has dangerous health situations they cannot resolve. Everyone agrees on that. And a lot of the public thinks that the solution to that is then just don't regulate abortion, just have it easily accessible so we don't even have to worry about these potentially problematic situations. And I think that there's a fallacy there because destigmatized, free access abortion at any point for any reason has its own costs. And one of those costs, what Eric was saying earlier, is this study that we talk about in the manifesto found that only 33% of women describe their abortions as wanted and consistent with their values and preferences. The majority of women getting abortions are either ambivalent about it, they say they accepted it, but it wasn't really consistent with what they believe in, or they said it was unwanted, or they said it was coerced. And this is in part, again, it's multifactorial, but in part the result of treating abortion as this morally neutral kind of throwaway thought, as treating it as, if you have any issues, any problems, whatever, just do the responsible thing, get rid of the pregnancy, and not realizing how, in fact, coercive that mentality can be. The Turnaway study found that when women were denied abortions, they physically showed up at clinics to get abortions, and they were turned away because they were too far for the gestational limit of the clinic. And the Turnaway study found that not only did nearly everybody who was denied an abortion and raised their child said they no longer wish they wanted to, is 98%. so they no longer wish they wanted to. But additionally, some of them felt more positive about it as soon as the option was taken off the table, because their family, their social circles stopped pushing them to get an abortion and said, well, I guess you're having this kid, so we will help. They have interviews of women talking about how once their family knew that they tried to get an abortion and couldn't, they got on board with helping them. This is a really important relationship between women and their communities and the availability of abortion. It's a complicated thing, and you could be pro-choice and believe that women should have the right to decide refusal of use of their bodies and that this is a fundamental core human right. You can believe that. And also recognize that as you fight for that, there are multiple ways this plays out. And you have a lot of women. If there's 1 million abortions a year, roughly speaking, then at least 240,000 women a year getting abortions they describe as unwanted or coerced. How does that play into autonomy? How does that play into that? Even if you don't care at all about the embryo or the fetus and their life, even if you don't care about that at all, this is still a complicated situation. It's one of the reasons we really want to be talking about how destigmatized abortion affects women.
You mentioned autonomy. I'm wondering, so for all of the women who say, yes, I was coerced, or I did, I felt like I had to get an abortion that I didn't want, what is the emotional toll on women? I feel like we don't talk about that a lot.
What's
This
interesting to
same
know,
study did look at that, and they found that only the women, the 33%, the 1/3 of women who said their abortions were wanted, those are the only women who reported more positive than negative emotions about the abortion and their mental health subsequent to the abortion. Now, that's not to say that every single other woman was traumatized for life. There's a variety of reactions. But women who, certainly the women who said they felt coerced, and then the women who said that they felt it was unwanted. But even the women who said that they accepted the abortion, although it was inconsistent with their values, even those women also attributed more negative than positive emotions to the abortion experience. And this coincides with some of the data from the Turnaway study, which found that women who described the decision to seek abortion as somewhat or very difficult were, unsurprisingly, way more likely to report emergent positive emotions when they were denied an abortion. So you have this group of women who they do go to a clinic to get an abortion. They've decided this is what they need to or ought to do. But when it's taken away from them, the ones who struggle with that decision are, unsurprisingly, more likely to kind of be okay with that. They even describe, it was something like, don't quote me on this, I don't know this as cold, but it was something like half of the women initially, with the denial initially, not 5 years later, but within a week, had some level of happiness about the denial. So this is a complicated situation. So when proponents for abortion rights talk about how there are these negative effects of being denied abortion, I don't think it's honest for us to pretend there aren't. Of course there are. Having children is a big deal. Pregnancy is a big deal. These are huge life-changing situations. But it is oversimplifying it. And it's oversimplifying the way women feel about abortions and about our children in ways that I think are, at best, unhelpful and at worst, profoundly anti-women.
I think we're really calling on both the pro-life community and the pro-choice community to stop oversimplifying these things. One of the things we call for in our manifesto for pivoting to this issue of unwanted and coercive abortions is the fact that, or a call for pro-lifers to change the way we talk, or at least to be careful about the way we talk about abortion. Commonly from hardcore pro-life people, you hear about how selfish abortion is, how abortions are being done for the sake of convenience.
Yeah.
There may be some abortions that could be categorized in that way, but the vast majority of abortions are being performed in situations where the woman is not making any kind of trivial decision, where, the choice to have a child, it's inconvenient to say that it's inconvenient to have a child is to say something ridiculous. It's an incredible lifelong burden. Most of my children are now adults, and I'm continuing to carry that burden. How do you help a child who's lost a job or been broken up with or been divorced? Becoming a parent is a massive lifelong choice. And for us to talk in terms of convenience and inconvenience, I think trivializes that. It trivializes the significance of a human life, the life of that child. And we really have to just reckon with the fact that that people are getting abortions for the sake of the child. Yes, they're going to kill the child in the process. We see that clearly. But in their kind of struggle to deal with the challenges of life, they're thinking this kid is not going to have the opportunities they need. If you read the testimonies, and I want to credit Monica with pointing me in this direction, it's shoutyourabortion.com. So many women are like, I prayed that this child would come back to me later. They really think in those terms. Like they see the child as a hypothetical person, not a person they're killing, that they want to do right by.
Yeah, it's from our perspective where you are taking an irreplaceable life permanently. It's very difficult to read, but it is important to try to read these testimonials not with the mindset of convincing them that we are right at this moment, but to understand where they are coming from. And it is surprising how many Shout Your Abortion testimonials involve women hoping the child will, quote, come back to them at another time, or hoping the child will go to I just read one, it's not in our manifesto, I just read this one last week, where a woman who considered herself Christian and for a variety of reasons did not think she could handle this pregnancy, prayed that God would give the baby to someone who could handle it. And then shortly after she got her abortion, a very close friend of hers announced a pregnancy, and she believed, so she said, that God basically reassigned that soul to someone else. Now, speaking as an atheist, I find that very dark and hugely problematic. But setting that aside for a minute, to Eric's point, they are conceptualizing this as a decision not just for their own sake, but for the child's sake. And while we would like to correct that perception very much, it's still important to understand what the motivations are and where people are coming from. And I just want to say I deeply agree. I didn't think about this till Eric and I talked about it while we were drafting the manifesto with Charlie Camosi. But I deeply agree with the problem of describing abortions in terms of convenience or inconvenience, because it implies that parenting is in terms of convenience or inconvenience. And while I wouldn't necessarily use the word burden, I would consider it a very noble and enormous undertaking, and almost the opposite of what you would consider convenient or inconvenient. I think parenting is wonderful. My children are very easily one of the best parts of my life. It's also it changes you. It changes your life. It changes you. It's an awesome responsibility, and I mean awesome in like the more, biblical sense, not like awesome like a hot dog. Awesome like a scary thunderstorm. Awesome in ways that you want people to take it seriously. You don't want them to take it so seriously and be so afraid of it that they choose abortion instead, but it's not about convenience, and it's weird for the people who generally are very pro-family and pro-life to diminish parenting to be about convenience. I think it might be a finer point. I don't like to spend so much time on language, but I do think it's telling. And
Well, the
I
wider,
will not
the
go so
wider
far as
problem
to
is like,
pretend.
to
Go ahead,
educate
Eric.
pro-life people to understand who's getting these abortions. And I've had the vast majority of people that I've shared the manifesto with and talked about this with. In fact, we sent out an email to our list last week, sharing it with them and inviting their comment. We're publishing it in our print newsletter that's going out. The vast majority of people are extremely excited about it, but I still get pushbacks saying, yeah, but they're making this horrible choice and they put an aspirin between your legs and all those kinds of horrible, horrible things. We need to educate pro-life people about how unwanted these abortions are so that they will simply sympathize more with these women. This is not just some girl sleeping around and being irresponsible and then just cavalierly going for an abortion. This is a woman who wants to be a mother, maybe already even is a mother, and maybe would love to be a mother of a baby right now, but who feels like the circumstances or the threats she's getting from her boyfriend or the actual literal gun to her head are keeping her from doing what she really wants.
One of the first things I thought of when I started considering this topic of coerced abortions, we hear this sometimes in context with sex trafficking and things of that nature, but that just is never, ever talked about, it seems like to me. But there is a connection. How can we use this, Monica, maybe to highlight the connection and the prevalence of sex trafficking in our country.
It's a tricky thing. Joyce McCauley Banner, who works with Feminists for Life, has a really great presentation discussing this and specifically trying to train people who interface with women regularly in healthcare, in pregnancy resource centers, things like that, to recognize potential signs of sex trafficking and what they can do about it. But that's a whole huge problem in itself. And if you want to talk about coercion, it hardly gets worse than that. And so a lot of times what the people who are caring for these women find is even if they can recognize an issue and even if they can set up a line of communication with the woman to feel she can trust them and talk to them about this problem, the next layer is the people working in healthcare or working with PRCs or wherever they're working. They need to know who to turn to get her resources, and sometimes there really isn't anyone. So the sex trafficking issue is like independent of abortion, a whole huge separate issue. But I do think it's important to realize there is a correlation. The group Support After Abortion has some pretty good research that they've shared about this. They have a fact sheet called Intersecting Factors with Abortion that looks at, I think it's 6 or 7 major intersecting factors that sometimes correlate with people getting abortions. They talk about substance abuse, domestic violence, homelessness. I don't remember all the factors off the top of my head, but one of them is sex trafficking, and they talk about how common it is for people being coerced into these situations to also be coerced into getting abortions so that they are still available for the sex part of sex trafficking. It's really gruesome. It's very dark. I don't find people really want to talk about it. I think that there is this idea among moderate pro-choicers of this idealized choice where women with full volition have considered all of their options, have the support they need to decide what they want, and then decide in an empowered way with full accurate information and with the support that they need, they decide, no, I've thought about all of this and I definitely want this abortion for XYZ reasons, and I should be able to do that because I should have control over my body. That's like often, I think, what people are thinking about. And that does happen. I think it's oversimplified for us to suggest that nobody is comfortable with abortion or even that nobody is glib about it. You have 1 million abortions a year, you're going to get all kinds of things. But it doesn't appear to be the majority of the case. A lot of times women are doing this because they feel they don't have a choice. I met a pro-choice activist, on TikTok that I started talking to offline more about it, and her story was very interesting. She was volunteering at a Planned Parenthood in her town, and she believes very strongly in supporting women in difficult situations. That's why she volunteered with this Planned Parenthood. And she had to stop for a year for her own mental health because she lived in a small enough town where she knew a lot of the women going to this clinic and she knew a lot about their various life circumstances. And she had to stop for her own mental health because she was helping so many women get abortions who she could tell didn't want to. They felt like they had to, and this was her telling me, she believed that many of them were going to go on to be devastated and struggle afterward, and she's here to help women. She's here to help women with whatever is best for their circumstances, sort of the ideal that we're talking about that many pro-choice people aspire to. But the reality of what she was doing, she started to feel like she wasn't really necessarily helping them, and she just didn't want to be involved for a while. She did go back. I don't want to misrepresent her. She went back and continues to volunteer with that clinic. I think she feels like it's her best option of a bunch of bad options to try to help people in difficult situations. But I think it's important for us to recognize not only that many of the women seeking abortion, they're not doing it glibly and they're not doing it cheerfully, not only that, but also to recognize that many of our opposition, our passionate, zealous, pro-abortion opposition, this is an important point. They do what they do because they believe they are helping women. I feel like the pro-life movement often describes people who actively promote abortion in terms of greed, in terms of wanting to have, full control over their life without restrictions and these various things. Again, I won't pretend that never exists, but there are thousands of pro-choice activists, and I think many of them, they want to help women that are in difficult situations and they want to protect them. That's why they're doing what they're doing. And again, full circle, that's why there should be common ground here. If the Planned Parenthood volunteer is frustrated and she needs to take a mental health break because the women she's helping don't even want these abortions. Hey girl, same team. What else? While you're volunteering at Planned Parenthood, what other things can we be doing so less of them are showing up at your door in the first place? What are some social and policy responses we can have that we can all agree on, even as we will continue to fight about other things. I don't want to pretend I'm not going to. I am. But while we're doing that, there just seems like there should be a lot of room for decreasing the demand in the first place.
Yeah.
Monica, I think your comments point to the kind of class element of this problem, the class divide, which is something that our co-author Charlie Camosi's spent a lot of time focusing on. We know that abortion is more likely to happen in the life of a poorer woman. We also know that abortion is more likely to be morally opposed by poorer women. Poorer women are significantly more pro-life than the top 10%.
Right.
Women whose incomes are over $100,000, only 1 out of 10 is what we would call pro-life, opposed to abortion in all circumstances. Fully 1 out of 4 women at the other end of the economic scale are pro-life in that really strong sense. And what that inevitably means is that many economically disadvantaged women are getting abortions that not only do they not more, kind of emotionally want, but that they're morally opposed to, from their own values. And I've long thought of legalized abortion and other things as a way for the elites to kind of force their lifestyle, or to force the consequences of their choices, which they're buffered from with their wealth and privilege, on other people. So rich women are less likely to need an abortion, but heck, it better be legal if they want one. And that means poor women are going to have to suffer with the loss of motherhood, are going to have to suffer with violating their own moral or even religious values at the behest often of somebody else or circumstance, and getting an abortion that we should see as a tragedy.
This is a very interesting point, because when I try to discuss that very exact angle in the circles we run in online, there are always people who say, see, this proves that pro-lifers are hypocrites and that they think abortion should be outlawed for anyone but them when they need one. I've noticed there's a total lack of distinction between, theoretically, there's this archetype in the pro-choice mindset of a woman standing outside an abortion clinic yelling mean names at people and then secretly going in the back door to get an abortion and then coming back out and continuing to do it. That's who they're thinking of. Someone who will vocally claim to be against abortion and want it to be illegal, and in the midst of claiming that, get one and then go right back to it as if nothing happened. That's the archetype. They don't recognize the difference between that thought and someone who opposes abortion because they used to support it until they got one and how it affected their lives. They don't recognize the difference between hypocrite and someone who's learned from trauma and is trying to prevent others from experiencing trauma. I also think that they don't recognize what we were saying before, how often destigmatized abortion affects not only individual women, but entire communities' outlooks on how to handle pregnancies. And it causes pressures for women to get abortions that might not have otherwise existed. A similar note, this is kind of a soapbox for me, but a couple weeks ago, there was the story out of Texas about the alleged increase in infant mortality because of the Texas heartbeat law. And what the authors meant and what the media coverage meant was that the Texas heartbeat law has prevented thousands of abortions, and those have resulted in live births. And some of those live births have died in infancy. In particular, the Texas heartbeat law does not have an exception for fetal anomaly. And so parents who receive a prenatal diagnosis of some kind of disability or fetal anomaly, there's no exception in the heartbeat law, and they go on to carry to term. Now, the coverage of this story described all of the additional children dying in infancy since the heartbeat law as children that parents were, quote unquote, forced to carry and then watch suffer and die heartlessly because pro-lifers don't care about born children, et cetera, et cetera. There was no discussion in any of that coverage of the systemic and very well documented phenomenon of the medical community pressuring, coercing, and even sometimes abusing parents into getting abortions they don't want because their children have a disability. There was also no discussion of the medical community's total disconnect with how people with disabilities rate the quality of their life. There was no discussion of the difference between a so-called incompatible with life diagnosis and a life limiting one, or the kinds of information that they give parents in these situations. None of that complexity, none of that history of ableism, none of that connection to the disability rights movement ever makes an appearance. They just assumed that everyone who carried to term when they got a disability diagnosis would have aborted if they could have, and they don't even realize how ableist and horrifying that assumption is. They assumed that everyone who was getting abortions after a prenatal diagnosis before the Heartbeat Law was, again, this myth of full information, full support, just making the best decision for themselves. And I will say again, some of them were doing that. Some of them did have full information and full support, and they decided they wanted an abortion. I am not pretending that doesn't happen. But the other side acts as if, of course, abortion is an obvious and easy, or at least simple, choice for a bunch of people, and everything deviating from it is a problem. And they just either are unaware of or completely ignore. And in the case of disability, again, I will say, this is documented. There is a lot of research where parents are talking about the horrific things that the medical community has said and done to try to get them to get an abortion, even for life-compatible things, much less for life-limiting ones. And there's just no knowledge or acknowledgement of this complexity when people talk about people wanting to get abortions and being forced to not. It's the same thing as what Eric said, where if you have these laws prohibiting abortion, they focus on all these people who they say wanted to and couldn't, but they have no knowledge of the people who would have been pressured into it and now can't be pressured into it, or at least it's a lot less likely. Mm-hmm. That is true tenfold when it comes to disability diagnosis, and we never see any even awareness of it, it appears.
I'm so glad you brought up that point, Monica. That's one of the things we highlighted in the manifesto at Public Discourse. And it goes to the trivialization of fetal life that is inevitable in a society that has abortion on demand. It's such a, at such a high level too. Abortion on demand all the way into the third trimester of pregnancy, it just leads to a coarsening of our sense of the value of unborn life. Physicians now, it's easy for them to discount the fetus. They don't think of the fetus as a patient of theirs to whom they're responsible. And talking to, pro-life physicians like, the wonderful Dr. Ingrid Scott from Charlotte Lozier Institute and others, they are just in anguish over how their profession has abandoned the unborn child as a patient who deserves to be cared for by the healing arts and by our physicians. So, wrapped up in the whole business of unwanted abortion is, the overall devaluing of human life, particularly in the medical community, that really does put tremendous pressure on families to abort those babies that they consider to be not worthy of being born.
And it's not only devaluing the lives of the literal actual children, it's also very corrosive to the parenting experience. This study that talked about infant mortality, at some point, it was either in the study itself or discussion of it, where the authors of the study cited one or two other studies claiming that parents who have to carry to term and watch their infant die are going to suffer, extreme mental anguish, which, first of all, yes, they are. But one of the studies they cited to justify this claim was a study that looked at parents who had lost born children and how much more they had negative mental health repercussions compared to parents who had never lost a child at all. And they compared that to getting an abortion versus having your infant die. And forget how we feel about fetal life. If you talk to parents who feel they need to get an abortion because of an adverse prenatal diagnosis, they're in agony. They don't see this as, oh, now I can avoid my child's death because I'm getting an abortion. They see it as either I have to choose my child's death in order to prevent suffering, or I have to watch my child die in infancy and that will be more suffering. It's death or death under different circumstances. And the people who did this infant mortality study compared it to a study where there were parents who experienced a death and parents who didn't. They're really kind of playing their hand without even noticing. And the only reason they can make such an absurd, offensive assumption like that is because of the way that treating abortion as a morally neutral act, and the way, as Eric just said, it loses all consideration for fetal life. That doesn't just affect fetuses' lives. It affects all of us in myriad ways that are all tied together. That's why I get so irritated when pro-choice people say it's the woman's business and no one else's. I wish, okay? Yeah. It's not like that at all. It affects everybody.
It affects everyone, because the family that decides not to abort their disabled child, well, That's on you guys. You're the one who
Yes.
chose to take this on. Why? Not just a disabled child. You know, one of our friends, Leah, what's her real last name? Leah
Sergeant?
Sargent. Thank you. Leah
Yeah.
Sargent talks about this, about the way that abortion has allowed, especially employers, to say, well, you can't breastfeed here. You're the one who chose to have this baby. You can't bring that baby in our midst. You can't have sick days because you chose to have this child. Why should it used to be that the entire society knew we are responsible for enabling families to care for their children, and if someone has a disabled kid, let's rally around and help them. Now you had a disabled child. You could have aborted that child and avoided that problem for yourself and all the rest of us. So why are you coming to us looking for help?
Yeah.
Your body, your problem.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm thinking about coercion. I'm thinking about all of the different industries that have been brought up so far, the abortion industry, the medical industry, all of these different groups. How do we turn the tide to expose that they are the arbiters of a lot of the coercion? Obviously, men are involved, other friends, family members are involved. We can have those conversations. But I'm just wondering, how do we go up against these two, especially these two big industries, to turn the tide of coercion there? Does that make sense? Like, I hear you guys talking about building bridges, and there are advocates on both sides, like common ground. There's never going to be common ground with the industries. And those are the ones that, I think a lot of the politicians are just clueless most of the time. But they're owned by these two big industries through lobbyists. So how do we combat that side of it?
I think it's actually not as bad as we think. When you talk about the abortion industry, maybe, but I think there are a lot of people in the medical industry, maybe even people who have what is the word I'm looking for? Participated in, purported this problem without meaning to. When we talk, gets back to Scott's original question, what do we mean by coercion? People, like if a guy is pointing a gun at a woman's head, he knows he's coercing her. But I think a whole great deal of what we're describing as coercion involves people who don't feel they're coercing anyone or don't even realize how the role they're playing is affecting the woman involved. And I think that's actually a note of hope, because I think there is room for increased education. There's room for people who want to do better and just need to know how. I really believe that. So as kind of a tangent, but obviously an adjacent issue, there are a lot of problems with the way the medical community handles miscarriage. There's a lot of problems with the way, on an emotional, mental health level, the medical community handles women and parents going through miscarriage. But what I have found in my work with that, because I've experienced it directly and I've talked with healthcare providers about it directly, is that it is almost always unintentional, and there is a great desire among healthcare providers for better training and better understanding. There's the same thing with prenatal diagnosis. There's research to show that the medical professionals that are most often in the position to give the prenatal diagnosis have felt like they have not been properly trained, they don't understand best practices, and they would be interested if they knew. So I think it's helpful for us to remember that yes, there are industries and there can be lobbyists and politicians involved, and there can be a lot of power and money in ways that we can't control, but there's also a lot of individual private citizens who, even if whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, they want to take care of people. And if we can increase education around common ground issues, I think that could be helpful. So the prenatal disability diagnosis is a good example. When I do talk about it with anybody I know who is not a hardcore pro-abortion activist specifically on Twitter, just anybody outside of that, there's a ton of common ground. There's immediate, easily accessible, similar emotions like this is an injustice, this isn't right, we should be better supporting these people, including medical professionals. I think a starting point is just finding talking points that don't require people to agree with us on the legality of abortion and that allow them to agree with us elsewhere. Freeing people to say where they agree without making it a wholesale group decision. This is similar to how when we talk about outreach to different demographics, we talk about secular people who would naturally oppose abortion, and maybe the only thing keeping them from doing it is they think that they can't be pro-life unless they're Christian, which is silly. And as soon as you just say, nah, it's okay, you've freed them. I think it's the same thing here, where there's a lot of places where you can say, you don't have to agree with me on X, Y, Z, that we can both agree. maybe ER staff should have a little bit of training on the emotional impacts of miscarriage. Maybe people giving prenatal diagnosis should be better connected to disability rights advocacy groups in their community. And they would be interested and happy to do so. I don't think we should assume from the get-go that the people involved in this are resistant to us. I think a lot of times it's just lack of an alternate voice.
So, Eric, as we wrap this up and we talk about finding common ground, I love the illustration that you all have. You use churches as an example of how maybe, for example, some conservative churches can work with more moderate churches who have different priorities. Kind of, if you can recall that example, just sort of walk us through that, because I think it's a great illustration of what can be.
Well, it's funny in the pro-life movement. I think in the pro-life movement is often seen as part of the conservative movement, which I think is kind of a shame in a lot of ways. Maybe was necessary for a while politically. I don't know, but there's I think a change is happening there, but there's I think a shift in what people are willing to consider, what people are willing to push for. And, we've tended to think of religious people as conservative. We've tended to think of the conservative movement or maybe the Republican Party as the most religious party. In fact, that's not true. The most religious people in the entire country are black people, and they are overwhelmingly Democratic. So the Democratic Party actually has the most religious people in the entire country in it. But we don't think about them, right? But my experience, in the black community in Chicago has been that there's an incredible opportunity for crossover here, because you have black pastors. There's an incredible black pastor in Chicago who is working to create a maternity home out of what used to be an old Catholic convent. But he's also feeding the poor at his church 2 days a week and doing hot dog roasts in the community. Pastor Charles Moody, he's able to present, an on-the-ground helping of actual families in the community, which includes a daycare center that accepts kids as young as 6 weeks old. Mm-hmm. And they're building a maternity home, and they've got a pregnancy a care center that's operating at their church. That model is a really great example. But I think it really comes down to personalities. It comes down to guys like Pastor Charles Moody, who's willing to do that. So I think the essential component here to really make that connection is our individual human relationships. So I think that's why the church example is so helpful, because pastors in a town, they tend to know each other. They know of each other at least. They can reach out and say, look, we've got this pregnancy care center that we could use some help with. You guys have got the soup kitchen you could use some help with. But that's got to happen at a personal level, which is, I think, why we're starting by addressing the pro-life community. We're reaching out to our friends in the pro-life community and saying, think differently about these things, learn this information, and then start to share it with others. How I wish that our politicians, I don't care what party they're from, but if they're advocating for women, or if they're advocating for families, or if they're advocating for unborn babies, for them to know this stuff.
Yeah.
The recently passed GOP platform, wouldn't it be beautiful if that had included talk about unwanted abortions, this common ground issue? I guess we have a long way to go before unwanted abortion shows up as a platform plank in somebody's party. But it's going to start by having these conversations one-on-one with our pro-life and our pro-choice friends.
Thepublicdiscourse.com, is that the best place to read the manifesto? Is that where we want to steer folks?
Yep, that's where it's.
It's also on the Secular Pro-Life blog, but that's just a reprint.
Yeah.
There you go. So either way, we would strongly encourage folks to check this out. It is really, we didn't even get into, I love some of the terminology that you've at least introduced to me, talking about like prenatal justice and things like that. I love it.
Credit to Charlie Camozzi. He's the one who's constantly beating the drum, and it's been transforming the way that I think about these issues.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. Monica Snyder, Eric Scheidler, thank you so much for joining us today on Dear Jane. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to Dear Jane.
You can follow along every day on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And make sure you also are subscribed so you never miss an episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as YouTube. Ring that bell so you're notified and you never miss an episode.